Socrates has a much more difficult time with Callicles than he does with either Gorgias or Polus. And that's why the discussion with Callicles is so much longer. With Gorgias, Socrates had him trapped right away, and that was it. With Polus, it was a little bit more difficult. Polus couldn't quite follow things. Polus put up more resistance, but eventually Socrates refuted Polus as well, got Polus to agree with Socrates. Callicles is not so easy. And this is illustrated by the fact that there are a series of failed refutations. Now, when you're reading through it, this can be kind of difficult to pick out. It looks like Socrates is just jumping around. He's just talking about one thing, then another thing, and it's really easy to get lost. But what's going on here is there is a series of attempts at refutations which fail. And then Socrates, as soon as he sees that it's failing or that it fails, he moves on to the next one. And there are three of these, three attempts at refutation before Socrates finally hits upon the successful argument. And in a way, these failed refutations set up the successful argument. We're going to see how that works by the time we get to the successful argument. And there are even more than these three arguments. Within each of these, it's possible to, within each of these three different refutations, failed refutations, there really are kind of two versions of each of them. There are two jar stories. There are two arguments that run under this life of the itcher thing, and there are two simultaneity arguments. What we're going to do is try to understand what's going on in these attempts at refutation very quickly, and we're going to see how Callicles responds to them, and so why they're kind of not successful. And then one of the things that we're going to pay attention to when we get to the successful refutation eventually, which will be in a further video, subsequent video, is how that successful refutation incorporates the kind of feedback that Callicles has given here in these failed refutations. Callicles complains, Callicles replies in certain ways to these failed refutations. That's why they're failed. But with the successful refutation, Socrates is able to evade all of the complaints or criticisms that Callicles raised in these earlier arguments. So first, these jar stories. So this is immediately after Callicles has laid out his position, right? He's got all this stuff about justice, all this stuff about philosophy, and then all this stuff about pleasure, about the good life, about justice, what you should devote yourself to, right? This kind of very thorough, comprehensive view of things. Socrates, all right, let's try to refute you now. And the first thing he brings out are these jar stories. So he says, oh, I heard these stories a while ago from a Sicilian, a guy, so Sicily was colonized by Greek city-states, and so they were still Greeks. They all spoke Greek. And he had these stories about jars. And he said, our appetites, our desires, they're like a jar. Yeah. And then we have to kind of satisfy them, fill those jars with our soul. Now, the life of pleasure, and again, Socrates is, I'm being a little bit clearer than Socrates is with these stories. The life of pleasure looks something like this. It looks like someone who's got a leaky jar who's trying to fill it up with something else that's leaky, like a sieve. He's got a leaky soul who's trying to fill up these appetites that just won't be satisfied, that won't be filled up. They keep growing and growing, right? And so this guy is trying to fill up this jar with liquid, but the jar is just letting it go. And so it'll never be full. It'll never be satisfied. There'll always be more desires. And he's trying to do it with his soul, and his soul's in a bad condition. It's leaky. It forgets things, whatever. Something like that is the idea. Doesn't that look awful? That's basically the argument, in as much as there's an argument. You don't want to be a guy like that. Look at him. He's not very happy. And Callicles responds saying, what? How is that even an argument? That's just no, fine, whatever. I don't care. Yeah, fill up your jars. Socrates comes back. Wait a minute. Imagine he told me another story. This guy from Sicily. He told me another story. He said, now what we should imagine is that you got a lot of jars. And if they're not full, it's very painful. Now we can compare two different people. On the one hand, we kind of have the guy that we started with originally. He's just got a lot more jars now, with leaky jars, and he's got this leaky sieve. And if his jars don't stay full, he's in a lot of pain. And we can compare that guy to someone whose jars are totally sound, don't leak at all, and his jars are full. And he doesn't have to work to fill them up. His jars are full, so he's not experiencing a whole lot of pain or anything like that, and he's just fine. Compare these two people, right? The guy who's got to always be filling up his jars and they're leaking, and it's painful if your jar isn't full, and yeah, someone like that. And then this other guy on the right. Wouldn't you rather be on the guy on the right? Socrates says. And Callicles says, no. That's the life of a statue. That guy on the left, yeah, he's got lots of pleasure. Yeah, there's pain involved, fine, because he has these desires, and desires are painful, right? That's what the pain is supposed to symbolize in the story. But no, yeah, I'd rather be the guy on the left. Sure, there's pain, but it's at least a life. The guy on the right's not even living a life. There's no pleasure at all. It's the life of a statue. Oh, Socrates says, okay, so these jar stories didn't work. Moving on, right? And so the idea, I think, here very quickly, these stories might be compelling or persuasive or convincing to someone who's already persuaded of Socrates' point of view, who's already kind of on the, not so sure about the kind of thing Callicles is saying, not so sure about hedonism. But to a committed hedonist, this isn't going to do anything. Not persuasive at all. There's hardly even an argument. And so Socrates moves on to what I am calling the life of the itcher argument. This is this argument takes the form of a reductio ad absurdum. It's a fancy Latin phrase. You can pull it out on your friends, really impress them, right? Latin's always impressive. What it means is something like reduce to absurdity. You can kind of read the English meaning off of the Latin words, reduce to absurdity. A reductio, and so Socrates attempts this on Callicles' hedonism. He attempts to reduce Callicles' hedonism to an absurdity. And what that means is he tries to show that hedonism implies something that is clearly or obviously false. He tries to show that hedonism implies or entails something that's absurd. And if hedonism implies something that's absurd, that's clearly false, well, then hedonism too has to be false, because true things don't imply false things. The absurdity in question is that the life of the itcher is a good life. What is the life of the itcher? Socrates asks us to imagine someone who's got an itch that will not go away. It's a lifelong itch, but this person is able to constantly itch it, right? He's not restrained or whatever. He's just itching away his whole life. And so the idea here would be that he has a desire, namely to itch, that he is always fulfilling throughout his whole life. And so according to hedonism, this guy is experiencing a lot of pleasure. And if pleasure is the good, which it is according to hedonism, well, then he must be living a good life. If hedonism is true, then this guy's life must be good. That's the good life. You see what that guy's doing right there? That's the good life. For itchers, that guy is doing what he wants. Itchers do what they want. They want to itch. And what we're imagining is someone who's, not tied down or whatever. They can just itch all the time. Always be satisfying a desire, right? And so Callicles, look, hedonism implies that that guy's living a good life. But that's crazy. That's not true. That's absurd. That guy's not living a good life. Look at the look on his face. He doesn't look happy. The life of the itcher is clearly not the good life. I mean, think about it like this. What kind of life do you want for your friends, for your loved ones, for your children? Right? However you would answer that, that's the good life. It's like a kind of way of getting at it. Would you want your children to have a lifelong itch that they can always itch, but no, that's not the good life. That's not what we should be aiming at as we live. That's not what we should organize our lives around. That's not the good life, but hedonism implies that it is. Well, then hedonism must not be true. There's the argument. What you'll notice is that this is, in fact, an argument. If hedonism is true, then the life of the itcher is a good life. But the life of the itcher is not a good life. Therefore, hedonism must not be true. It is a logically valid argument. People call it modus tollens, in case you're interested. I'm not going to test you on that. But the logic of the argument works. It's airtight. So then, how might Callicles respond? How does Callicles respond? So this is a failed refutation. What's the problem with it? There are two ways to respond to a reductio ad absurdum argument. First, someone like Callicles, right, the person who has been confronted with this argument, could deny that the position implies the absurdity. For example, a hedonist could argue that hedonism doesn't imply that the itcher lives a good life. So they would need to give an argument here. They would need to say something, because Socrates had spent some time saying, kind of building up this idea. Look, pleasure is simply doing what you want. This itcher gets to do what they want. So wouldn't hedonism entail that this person's living a good life? So the hedonist would have to say something here, would have to give some sort of reason or argument or explanation for why hedonism doesn't entail this absurdity. Callicles doesn't do that. The second way to respond to a reductio ad absurdum argument is to bite the bullet. And what that means, and that's a kind of technical phrase, believe it or not, within philosophy. What that means is to assert that the thing claimed to be absurd is not in fact absurd. That the thing claimed to be false is not in fact false. To insist, to assert, to argue that the absurdity, quote unquote, is in fact true. So what would happen here is the hedonist would admit that hedonism implies that the itcher lives a good life, but say, that's fine, that's true. The itcher does live a good life. That's what Callicles does. So he doesn't respond in that first way. He bites the bullet. He says, fine, this itcher that you like, he lives a good life. Fine. Now, I think what we start seeing crop up here from Callicles, he starts kind of complaining. Like, why are you talking about itching? I don't want to talk about itching. Why are you talking about this? I'm talking about politicians and bravery and the great people and justice, these big issues, right? You're talking about itching, Socrates. So fine, whatever. I don't want to talk about itching. Fine, the itcher lives a good life. I don't care. Right? So Callicles does offer a response, but I think what's kind of more forceful about his reply, or like how he's really replying, is he's more complaining about the choice of example. I don't want to talk about itching. So this doesn't work. Now recall, what Socrates is trying to do, he's not just trying to give a good argument, so to speak, an argument that can't be replied to. He's trying to get the person he's talking to agree with him. That's key. He's not just trying to develop some nice argument in the abstract. He's trying to get Callicles to agree with Socrates. That's what Socrates is trying to do. And so I think what he sees here, life of the itching, this is not going to work. Callicles is going to complain. He doesn't like these kinds of examples. Okay, fine. You don't like talking about itching. Fine. So we'll move on. And so the last set of failed refutations that Socrates proposes, and we're going to go over these very quickly. These are the most complicated. These are very somewhat complicated arguments. We're not going to go into the details, but there are these two simultaneity arguments. I call them simultaneity arguments. I didn't call them that. The reason I call them that is because they deal with the fact that pleasure and pain occur simultaneously. So first, according to Socrates, Callicles' hedonism implies that one can do well and do badly at the same time, that one can live a good life, live the good life, and live a bad life at the same time. But that's impossible. And so Callicles' hedonism must be false. Why does his hedonism imply that? Well, it has to do with the nature of pleasure. If you recall, pleasure arises from satisfying a desire, and desires are painful. And so, what, according to Socrates, happens is that you experience pleasure and pain at the same time. You necessarily experience them simultaneously. As soon as the desire is filled, and so the pain is gone, well, then the filling of the desire is gone too, and so the pleasure is gone. Pleasure and pain, pleasure always occurs alongside pain. Well, if pleasure is what makes you live a good life and pain is what makes you live a bad life, hedonism seems to imply that you live a good life and live a bad life at the same time. But that's crazy. That's absurd, right? And Socrates uses the example of, I can't remember if it's eating or if it's drinking, but he uses an example like that, right? Eating when you're hungry or drinking when you're thirsty. So there's one of these simultaneity arguments, right? Hedonism has this implication, which is false. Second, similarly, hedonism implies that good and bad things must come to an end at the same time, must come to an end simultaneously, because the pain comes to an end as soon as the desire is fulfilled, but the pleasure comes to an end as soon as the desire is fulfilled, right? Because pleasure is just the filling of a desire. And if you don't have a desire, if your desire is filled, you can't experience pleasure. And so hedonism, which says that the good things are pleasures and the bad things are pains, implies that good and bad things must necessarily end at the same time. But that's not true. They need not end at the same time. And so again, Callicles' hedonism implies something that's not true. Now, Callicles has less of a response to these arguments. With the life of the itching argument, he at least offered what was a cogent response, right? He bit the bullet, so to speak. That's a legitimate response, a way to respond to the argument. With these simultaneity arguments, he doesn't really offer a response like that. All he really does is lodge the same kind of complaint that he lodged against the life of the itcher argument. He says, look, Socrates, you're talking about eating and drinking. You're talking about these base, vulgar, or everyday, common, stupid little things, trivial things. That's not what I'm concerned with. I'm talking about bravery and heroes and power and justice and whatever. I'm talking about all these noble, exalted, amazing things. And here you are talking about drinking when you're thirsty, Socrates. That's not really a reply to these arguments. It's not clear what exactly or how exactly Callicles would reply to these arguments. But for Socrates, what he sees is that these arguments, no matter what else he says, are not going to convince Callicles. They're not going to get Callicles to agree with Socrates, because these arguments deal with trivial things like eating and drinking. And maybe that's not a very good complaint, but it's adequate to show Socrates that he needs to try a different tack in order to get Callicles to admit that Socrates is right. And so that's exactly what Socrates does.